You know that classic image of the American West? Cowboys and Indians and saloons.
Wide open spaces.
Yeah.
Right?
Um, Turns out it's not the whole story.
No, not at all.
Today we're going to unpack the myths and the realities of this period,
Yeah.
using excerpts from The Unfinished Nation to help guide us. It focuses specifically on the Far West,
Right.
and it's going to be pretty eye-opening.
It is. What's interesting is that by the 1870s, the West was already incredibly diverse,
Oh, yeah.
culturally and economically. It wasn't just some empty frontier waiting to be tamed.
Right.
It was a place with its own established societies and economies and conflicts,
Yeah.
all about to be thrown into a whirlwind of change.
Okay, so let's ditch those Hollywood stereotypes then.
Yeah, let's...
And dive into the real deal. And our textbook makes it very clear that the West was much more multiracial and complex
It really was.
than those old movies would have us believe.
Totally.
Right.
Like, think about that iconic John Gast painting, American Progress. You know, the one to the angelic figure?
Yeah.
Floating westward, bringing light and technology.
Right.
Well, Native Americans are pushed into the shadows.
Yeah, I remember that one. Beautiful painting.
Yeah.
But looking back, it's pretty messed up, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's like...
It's glorifying the displacement of entire cultures.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It reflects this prevailing attitude of the time manifest destiny.
Right. Right.
This belief that westward expansion was inevitable, a divinely ordained... Right.
Wow.
And it completely ignores the reality of what was happening
Yeah.
to those who already called the West home.
It's like the painting itself is a myth-making machine,
It is.
creating this sort of narrative of progress and civilization,
Right.
but meanwhile sweeping the real human cost under the rug.
Totally.
So who are all these people whose lives were about to be
Yeah.
turned upside down?
Well, before large-scale white settlement, the West was already home to a vast array of established societies. Like, you had over 300,000 indigenous people
Really?
living on the Pacific coast alone. And then you had the Plains Indians,
Right.
who relied heavily on the buffalo
Yeah.
and roamed across a huge swath of territory.
Wow. I never realized just how many Native Americans were already living in the West
Yeah.
before all the waves of white settlers arrived.
It's a lot. Really?
Puts things in perspective.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just Native Americans, right?
No,
There were Hispanic communities too.
absolutely. Take New Mexico, for instance.
Okay.
After the U.S. acquired it from Mexico in 1848,
Right.
you had a large Hispanic population living there, people who had been there for generations.
Yeah.
And they were understandably worried about losing their land, their culture,
Yeah.
their entire way of life.
It's a pattern that seems to repeat itself throughout history.
It does.
One group comes in and displaces another,
Yeah.
often with devastating consequences. Didn't the same thing happen in California
Oh, yeah.
with the gold rush?
Absolutely. The Californios,
Right.
those wealthy Hispanic landowners who had held significant power
Yeah.
under Mexican rule, they saw their world turned upside down practically overnight.
Wow.
The gold rush brought a flood of English-speaking settlers,
Right.
and the Californios were often pushed aside,
Really?
sometimes through legal maneuvering and manipulation of the
Right.
U.S. court system.
So they lost their land, their status,
Everything.
their place in society.
Yep. It's heartbreaking to think about what those families must have gone through.
It is.
And it wasn't just California, right? What about Texas?
Same story played out in Texas with the Tejanos,
Okay.
Hispanic landowners there. They faced similar challenges
Hmm.
as Anglo-American settlers arrived in increasing numbers,
Right.
bringing with them new laws, new customs,
Yeah.
and a hunger for land.
It's a lot of change.
It is.
So we've got Native Americans, Hispanic communities,
Yeah.
all facing this immense pressure from white settlement.
Right.
Were there other groups caught up in this whirlwind of change?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I know the Chinese played a huge role in building the railroads.
What was their experience like?
Well, thousands of Chinese immigrants, mostly men,
Okay.
came to the West seeking opportunity.
Yeah.
They provided essential labor, often under incredibly harsh conditions,
Right.
to build the Transcontinental Railroad,
Uh-huh.
and their contributions are often overlooked
Yeah.
in the grand narrative of westward expansion.
It's a tragic part of this history
It is.
that many Chinese women who came to the West
Right.
were forced into prostitution.
Yeah.
They were vulnerable, far from home, and often exploited
Absolutely.
by those who saw them as commodities rather than human beings.
Exactly. and as Chinese immigrants became more successful,
Oh, right.
establishing businesses and communities.
Okay.
It fuels a backlash.
Oh, no.
Anti-Chinese sentiment was rampant,
Uh-huh.
driven by economic anxieties and racial prejudice.
So this ultimately led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
It did, which effectively barred Chinese immigration and naturalization for a decade.
Wow. It's a stark reminder that the land of opportunity wasn't always so welcoming,
It wasn't.
especially if you weren't white.
That's right.
It seems like the West was built on the backs of a very diverse workforce,
It was.
but with a very clear hierarchy in place.
Absolutely. While the West's economic boom relied on a diverse workforce,
Mm-hmm.
it was a system built on inequality.
Okay.
Whites typically occupied the higher-paying positions,
Yeah.
while ethnic minorities were often relegated to dangerous and low-paying jobs
Right.
in mines on railroads and in agricultural fields.
Makes you wonder what life was really like in those boom towns, especially for those who weren't at the top of the social ladder.
Right. It was a different world.
What were those social dynamics like?
Well, think about a place like a mining town.
Okay.
You had people from all walks of life thrown together,
Right.
all chasing their fortunes, all living in close quarters.
Yeah.
It was a volatile mix.
Yeah, I bet.
Those towns were known for their saloons, gambling dens, and yes, a certain level of lawlessness.
Mhm.
It was a place where fortunes could be made and lost overnight,
Wow.
and where social norms were often bent or broken.
I bet there are some wild stories from those days.
Oh, there are.
Speaking of which, I remember reading about a woman named Pearl de Vere.
Oh, yeah.
Wasn't she some kind of legendary figure in
Oh,
those
yeah.
mining towns?
Pearl de Vere. Now, there's a story for you.
Okay, tell me more.
She was a madam, and a very successful one at that.
Really?
She built quite an empire for herself
Wow.
in the midst of all that chaos and opportunity.
That's amazing.
Her story really highlights the complex social dynamics of the West.
Yeah,
And it reminds us that women played all sorts of roles in shaping this era,
right.
even if those roles weren't always recognized or celebrated.
Okay, so we've got this diverse and complex West,
Uh-huh.
this melting pot of cultures and ambitions all thrown together,
Yeah,
all vying for a piece of the pie.
right.
Then in 1869, everything changes.
Yeah.
The Transcontinental Railroad is complete,
Right.
and the West is forever transformed. Talk about a game changer.
Huge game changer.
What were the immediate impacts of this technological marvel?
Well, the Transcontinental Railroad was a true turning point.
Oh,
Suddenly, travel time from east to west was slashed from months to mere days.
wow.
It opened up markets for goods,
Great.
facilitated even more rapid westward migration,
Uh,
and as you mentioned, it changed the entire dynamic of the cattle industry.
so no more long cattle drives.
Exactly. Once beef could be shipped east by rail,
Right.
those long, arduous cattle drives became a thing of the past.
Wow.
It's a perfect example of how technology can reshape entire industries,
Yeah.
sometimes in unexpected ways.
But it wasn't all positive.
Right, it wasn't.
Didn't the railroad also play a significant role in the further displacement of Native Americans?
Unfortunately, yes. The railroads were instrumental in opening up Native American lands to white settlement,
Right.
accelerating the conflict and displacement that was already underway.
Right.
It's a classic example of how technological progress can have both intended and unintended consequences,
Yeah.
and how those consequences often fall most heavily on those who are already marginalized.
It's a sobering reminder that progress for some often comes at the expense of others.
It does.
So with the railroad in place and white settlement increasing,
Yeah.
what was the government's approach to dealing with the Native Americans who were already living there?
Well, the government implemented the reservation system,
Okay.
which is essentially designed to confine Native American tribes to specific areas,
Uh-huh.
often on land that was considered less desirable for white settlement.
Right.
It was a way to control Native American populations and open up more land for white settlers to exploit.
It sounds like a pretty raw deal
It was.
for the Native Americans. Didn't the government also make treaties with these tribes?
It did.
Were those treaties honored?
Sadly, many of those treaties were broken or manipulated to benefit white settlers.
Sure.
The displacement of Native Americans from their ancestral lands is a heartbreaking and often overlooked chapter of this history.
Yeah.
And it's one that continues to have repercussions today. It was a period of immense loss, cultural disruption, and violence for Native American communities.
Yeah. It's almost impossible to imagine being forcibly removed from land your family has lived on for generations.
That's terrible.
It's a tragic injustice that continues to cast a long shadow.
It does.
But the reservation system wasn't the only way the U.S. government tried to control Native Americans.
No, it wasn't.
Didn't they also pass a law aimed at breaking up tribal lands?
They did.
Yeah.
In 1887, the Dawes Severalty Act was passed.
Okay.
The idea was to divide tribal lands into individual allotments,
Yeah.
with the goal of assimilating Native Americans into white society by turning them into independent farmers.
Okay.
The government believed that private land ownership would force Native Americans to adopt a more civilized way of life.
Interesting.
However, it was a misguided attempt at forced assimilation, and it ultimately backfired.
It sounds like the Dawes Act was based on a complete misunderstanding of Native American culture and values.
It was.
I mean, land ownership wasn't really a thing for many tribes.
Right.
Their relationship with the land was much more communal and spiritual.
Exactly. The Dawes Act didn't just fail to achieve its assimilation goals.
Uh-huh.
It also resulted in the loss of millions of acres of Native American land.
Oh, wow.
The land that was allotted to individuals was often unsuitable for farming,
Right?
and many Native Americans lacked the resources or knowledge to make a living from it. So they ended up selling their allotments to white settlers,
Oh, no.
further eroding tribal land holdings.
It's a pattern of exploitation that seems to repeat itself over and over again.
It does, unfortunately.
Take away their land, disrupt their way of life,
Yeah.
and then offer them a path to assimilation that's essentially designed to strip them of their cultural identity.
That's right.
It's just heartbreaking.
That's a dark chapter in American history.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand that this forced assimilation wasn't limited to the Dawes Act.
Okay.
There were other efforts often driven by well-intentioned but misguided reformers
Right.
to civilize Native Americans.
Like those infamous Indian boarding schools we hear so much about these days.
Exactly. Starting in the late 19th century, Native American children were forcibly removed from their families
Wow.
and sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their native languages,
Really?
practice their traditional religions,
Wow.
or even wear their hair in traditional styles.
It's just horrifying to think about the trauma inflicted on those children.
It was traumatic.
To be ripped away from your family, your community, everything you know,
Yeah.
and forced to conform to a completely foreign way of life. It's no wonder the impact of those schools is still felt today.
It is. The legacy of those boarding schools is a complex and painful one.
Yeah.
While some students may have benefited from the education they received, for many, it was an experience marked by abuse, neglect, and the loss of cultural identity.
Right.
The intergenerational trauma caused by these schools continues to affect Native American communities today.
It's a stark reminder that the ruins of the past are still very much present.
They are.
So, as white settlement continued to encroach on Native American land,
Yeah.
and as the government pursued these policies of assimilation and control, was there any resistance? I mean, did Native Americans just accept their fate without a fight?
Of course not. Native Americans resisted these intrusions in countless ways.
Okay.
From peaceful protests to armed uprisings,
Right.
they fought to protect their homelands, their families, their
Right.
cultures.
Yeah.
The series of conflicts known as the Indian Wars were a direct result of this resistance, and they were often brutal and devastating for both sides.
I can't even imagine what it must have been like to face that kind of pressure,
Yeah,
to see your world crumbling around you,
right.
and to feel like you have no choice but to fight back. Were there any Native American leaders who emerged during this period?
Oh, yeah.
Names that we might recognize today.
Absolutely. Figures like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull,
Okay.
leaders of the Sioux resistance.
Right.
They became symbols of Native American resilience and defiance. Crazy Horse, known for his bravery and tactical brilliance.
Yeah.
He played a key role in the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876,
Oh, right.
where a combined force of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes defeated General Custer and his troops.
Wow.
It was a stunning victory for the Native Americans.
Yeah.
But it was short-lived.
Custer's last stand, right? I remember learning about that in school. It's
Yeah.
one of those historical events that's become almost legendary.
It has.
But it wasn't really the end, was it?
No, it wasn't. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, while significant, only fueled the U.S. government's determination to crush Native American resistance.
Right.
In the years that followed, the U.S. Army pursued a relentless campaign against the tribes, ultimately leading to the tragic massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890.
Oh, gosh.
Over 300 unarmed Lakota Sioux, mostly women and children,
Wow.
were killed by U.S. soldiers. It marked a devastating and bloody end to the Indian Wars.
It's hard to even comprehend that level of violence, to think that unarmed women and children were massacred like that. It's a shameful stain on American history.
It is. It's a moment that we need to remember, to learn from, and to honor the memory of those who were lost.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that not all tribes went down without a fight.
Okay.
The Chiricahua Apache, led by the legendary Geronimo,
Correct.
waged a fierce resistance for years, using their knowledge of the rugged terrain to their advantage. They fought for their freedom, their way of life, until they were finally forced to surrender in 1886.
It's a testament to their strength and resilience that they held out for so long against such overwhelming odds.
It is.
But even surrender wasn't the end, was it? What happened to these tribes after the Indian Wars were over?
They were confined to reservations, often on land that was far different from their traditional homelands.
Right.
They were forced to adapt to a new way of life, one that was often dictated by the government.
Right.
Their cultures and traditions were suppressed, and their children were sent to boarding schools. It was a period of immense hardship and cultural loss.
It's almost impossible to grasp the full extent of what Native Americans endured during this period.
It was a lot.
But alongside the violence, the forced assimilation, and the loss of land, wasn't there also an intentional effort to destroy their very way of life?
There was. Yeah. One of the most devastating blows to the Plains Indians was the destruction of the buffalo herds.
Right.
White hunters driven by profit.
Yeah.
Or simply a desire to eradicate a symbol of Native American culture.
Wow.
Slaughtered millions of buffalo, often leaving the carcasses to rot.
It's hard to believe that something so senseless could happen.
It's terrible.
It's like they were trying to wipe out an entire species just to break the spirit of the Native Americans who depended on them.
The decimation of the buffalo herds was a deliberate act of ecological and cultural warfare.
Wow.
For the Plains Indians, the buffalo was more than just a source of food and clothing.
Right.
It was central to their spiritual beliefs and their entire way of life.
Mm-hmm.
The loss of the buffalo had a devastating impact on their ability to survive and thrive.
It's a truly heartbreaking story, and it's one that often gets overshadowed by the more romanticized versions of the West.
It does.
It's like the real story is too painful to acknowledge.
It's essential to remember that the West was a place of great beauty and opportunity, but also of immense suffering and injustice.
Right.
The history of the American West is a complex tapestry of triumph and tragedy.
Yeah.
And we need to acknowledge all of its threads, even the darkest ones.
Well said. So we've explored the dark side of westward expansion.
Right.
The displacement of Native Americans, the broken treaties, the violence and the cultural destruction.
Yeah.
But the West wasn't just about conquest and conflict, was it? There were also incredible economic forces at play.
There were.
Driving people westward and shaping the destiny of the region.
That's right.
That's a wrap on this deep dive into the American West. Thanks for joining us.